Okay, here we go. Oh wait, where did we get to? Can't remember. Oh yes, she'd smashed the tapestry in Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert's bedroom, but she did find the key and she reckons she's going to go back at some point and try and get into that secret room again. But remember, Mrs. Gilbert, she was expecting a serious telling off from her, but actually when Mr. Gilbert told her, all she did was storm off with a basket and stop by the hothouse and then disappear. So we're not sure. But here we go. Chapter 17, Will's Plan. As Clara helped prepare tea, buttering bread, cutting thick slices of ham and washing juicy red tomatoes, she wished she could run outside and check the hothouse, for she was sure that that was where Mrs. Gilbert had been going, with the basket. But why? For a second Clara thought, then the ham knife slipped, narrowly missing her thumb. Could her aunt be? Was she the... No, Mrs. Gilbert would not steal from the Earl. Clara's father had always said how dedicated Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert were to their jobs on the estate. That was one of the reasons they hardly ever came to visit. For them to steal and risk losing their beloved jobs was too foolhardy to even imagine. Clara sat at the kitchen table and began to eat a slice of bread and ham with a large helping of pickled cucumber on the side. She glanced at Mrs. Gilbert's waiting plate. She had not yet returned from her errand. She had been gone for over an hour. Mr. Gilbert was chewing his sandwich slowly, occasionally glancing at the door. Perhaps now would be a good time to see if he had any answers to the unsolved puzzles rolling around in her head. What is the bedroom for? The one next to yours? Clara asked Mr. Gilbert, wiping cucumber juice from the corner of her mouth. Mr. Gilbert's jaw paused mid-chew. He coughed, as if the crumbs were caught in his throat. He placed the sandwich down and slowly brushed the flour dust from his hands. He gazed steady and fixed on Clara. The door to the gardens opened and shut again. Clara anchored her feet to the floor. She waited for Mrs. Gilbert to come in, preparing for her steely gaze, sharp words and a suitable punishment, remember, for the tapestry. But instead, she heard her aunt's feet treading slowly up the stairs. Clara glanced at Mr. Gilbert, who had started to chew again. He massaged his throat as if he was having trouble swallowing. He had still not answered her question about the room, and it seemed he wasn't about to. I spoke with Elizabeth about the tapestry. She knows it was an accident, he said. His voice was low and cranky. Guilt and sorrow burned in Clara's chest. It had been an accident, even though she did not like Mrs. Gilbert one small bit. It was somehow important to her aunt that her aunt knew that. She pushed back her chair and strode to the door. Clara, Mr. Gilbert said, but Clara ignored him, bounding up the stairs, 2 at a time, before Mr. Gilbert had even reached the kitchen door. She stood outside Mrs. Gilbert's bedroom. Funny noises were coming from inside, like a small animal was trapped and needing rescuing. Clara pressed her palms to the wood. A door creaked. The animal noise stopped. Clara gave a tentative look. Mrs. Gilbert, may I speak with you? Silence. I just want you to know that I am truly sorry for breaking the tapestry frame. More silence. Then feet padded across the floorboards inside the room. The door creaked open. Mrs. Gilbert looked as Clara had never seen her before. High spots of colour bloomed on her cheeks. Her eyes were bright. Behind her, on the floor near the bed, Clara could see the basket Mrs. Gilbert had taken into the garden. It was empty, a red checked cloth neatly folded at the bottom. Mrs. Gilbert blinked, as if she had just woken up and was seeing Clara for the first time. Clara stared at her in surprise. Where was the punishment, the shouting and the sternness? It was like a giant paper straw had sucked away all of Mrs. Gilbert's malice and anger, leaving her as a hollow-out eggshell. Go to bed, Clara. It's been a long day, she said wearily. She pressed the door shut. Clara stood there for a second, placing her hand on the door again. She felt something curious inside, a pang of regret for Mrs. Gilbert's weary, heavy eyes and the weight which stooped her shoulders. So it obviously looked as if she'd almost been crying. Clara watched the gardens from her window, just as Will had asked her when she had left him that night before. The only problem was that her eyes were laden with tiredness, closing every few seconds and then jerking open again when a fresh burst of rifle fire ricocheted through the night. She glanced at the spiders, who seemed oblivious to the noise. She wished for a second that she could join them in their webs and have nothing more to worry about than keeping a neatly spun home and catching a fly or two for tea. Will had been wrong. She was not getting used to the regiment's nightly practice. If anything, as the nights went on, she was finding them harder to bear. A constant reminder of the waiting envelope from the War Office and how the words inside might throw her family's life off kilter. She and her mother and father, they were like wooden skittles waiting to be knocked over by a large ball, with no one to pick them up, brush them down and stand them up straight again. Clara's candle burned low as she waited. She picked at the blob of wax which had dripped onto the windowsill. She clenched her toes in her boots. She needed to think about horrible things, she decided. They would keep her awake in between the burst of the gunfire. Then, just before she could dig down into her darkest thoughts, she saw a single pinprick of light by the boiler house steps. Her signal. Throwing off the nightgown, she pulled on over her clothes, although there'd really been no need, as it never seemed to occur to Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert to check on her after she'd gone to bed. Clara tiptoed down the stairs. She paused on the first floor, listening to the rise and fall of Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert's rhythmic snores. Then she ran lightly down the final set of stairs and opened the door to the gardens. Pulling it closed behind her, she rushed through the dark, her feet remembering the path like notes on the piano. "You came," whispered Will, who was sitting on the low brick wall in front of the steps, a folded blanket on his lap. "Of course," whispered Clara. "Why wouldn't I?" Will smiled. I'm just glad it's all." He held something out in his hand. Clara blinked in surprise. Another mandarin. "It was the entrance of the hothouse," Will said. "How odd," said Clara, taking it from him and giving it a sniff. The citrus smell tickled her nose. "Very," said Will. "Could it be the thief?" asked Clara, handing it back. "There's only one way to know for sure, and that's to catch whoever is doing this." There was something in the tone of Will's voice that Clara couldn't read. "So, do you have a plan?" whispered Clara. "Are we going to hide in a bush or in the orchard? We would have a good view from the hothouse up on the slope." Will shook his head, pushing the mandarin into his pocket. "I think we should watch from inside the pineapple house." "What?" said Clara, her voice rising from a whisper. Will pressed a finger to his lips. "But that's madness. Surely Robert will be watching the gardens, like Mr. Gilbert told him to. We'll get caught, and he'll be angry that you were out." Will rubbed it at his neck as if it was sore. "I told you, Robert sleeps like the dead. There's no chance he'll be in the gardens tonight. Come on, let's go and catch this fruit thief." Clara folded her arms around her middle, trying to quell the tiny shivers rolling through her body. Her mother had told her to look on her stay with her aunt and uncle as a little adventure, but she very much doubted that her mother had imagined that adventure would involve Clara roaming the gardens at night with her new friend trying to catch a pineapple thief. Chapter 18, will we fit it in? Yeah. Pineapples. Even a picture of one at the top. The pineapple hothouse was different at night. The dark, mellow warmth expanded in Clara's lungs, while the occasional quiet gurgle of hot water pipe tickled her ears as the spiky pineapple crowns quietly watched over them. Will's feet came to a sudden stop and Clara bumped into his back. "Sorry," she said hastily. Will seemed not to have heard. The blanket he was carrying dropped to the ground. His head was bent over at the pot plant. "Look at this," he whispered dullly, placing his hand on the rim of the pot. Clara frowned. The spiky leaves were there, but the pineapple had been cut from the stalk. The other pineapples nearby appeared to be staring, their crown of leaves bristling in shock. "This scarlet Brazilian had only just ripened," he said. His voice was thick with emotion. Clara watched as Will stroked the lengths of the leaves and examined the stalk the pineapple had been cut from. He dropped his hands to his sides, balled them into a fist. Taking things that don't belong to you, it makes my blood boil. An onion-sized lump formed in Clara's throat. She reached down and picked up the blanket. We need to catch whoever did this. She laid the blanket on the gravel under the planting bench, halfway down the hothouse. They sat close, knees pulled to their chins, their backs to the panes of glass. It reminded Clara of playing house when she was small, how Mother would give her sheets that smelled of lavender water to drape over the living room furniture, so she could make dens and have tea parties with her dolls. They sat in silence, the earthly air warm and still. A drip of condensation plopped onto the bench above them. The windows shook and blustered in the wind. Do you find the days long here? Clara asked after a while. Will glanced at her. Long? I suppose, it feels different here. There isn't much to do. I miss home. And school. It's like us. You miss school? Will said, raising his eyebrows. Can't say I do. I prefer the I prefer to be outdoors drawing. I suppose I do miss some of my friends, like Johnny. Once he stole Mrs. Brown's glasses and put them on in the lesson. Everyone laughed, and it took her forever to even notice, probably because she couldn't see herself. Clara smiled. It was nice talking to Will about school. It made home seem not so far away. Today was curious, she whispered, picking up a piece of gravel and rolling it around in her palm. She told Will about the broken tapestry, the key to the locked room hidden behind the bed, Mrs. Gilbert's meeting, Mr. Gilbert near the hothouse, the wicker basket covered with a cloth. The water pipes ticked and hissed. Mrs. Gilbert had a basket? Will asked. Clara nodded. And she was near the hothouse? Clara nodded again. A wave of dizziness washed over her. What? You think she could be taking the fruit? Will leaned forwards. It's possible. No. Clara picked up another piece of gravel and placed it next to the first in her palm, like two people standing shoulder to shoulder. She brushed the gravel from her hands. My aunt and uncle are devoted to their jobs. They would never steal. There are food shortages, a sugar tax. People will pay good money for sweet things, Will whispered. Clara thought about this. The Gilberts' cottage was musty and dusty, and they clearly did not have a lot of money, but there was always plenty of food on the table. Whatever Will thought, she did not for 1 second believe that they were stealing from the Earl. Reaching into his pocket, Will pulled out a notebook. After you left last night, I checked the hothouse, made a list of the fruit which had gone missing. Clara gasped. But what if you'd been caught? Will gave Clara a smile. I was careful. Clara leaned over and looked at Will's notebook, which was balanced on his knees. In the dim light, she saw that, next to the list of missing fruit, he had drawn pictures of perfectly shaded peaches and 3 pineapples, the crowns twisting around the fruits, protecting them like vines. Next to them, he had written, Scarlet Brazilian. Why does the Earl like pineapples? Clara asked. Status, Will whispered. Do you know some fruiteers take the crown of a homegrown pineapple and attach it to one that has come from another country? But why? To deceive the dinner guests, make them think it was grown in the hothouse of their hosts. Clara gazed at the fruit. A small bead of affection for them was growing inside of her. Perhaps not as much affection as Will had for them, but affection all the same. Pineapples used to be grown in horse manure to keep them warm. Imagine the smell. Will held his nose and wriggled his eyebrows. Clara stifled a giggle, stifled a giggle even. Will was like his brother Robert in some ways. The freckles which bounced on their cheeks, the way their nose crinkled, and, in other ways, not at all. When Robert spoke about fruit and vegetables, he was interested in how many people they would feed. But to Will, the fruits were so much more than that. The feeling was building inside of her, like a stream welcoming meltwaters from thawing mountains. The tightness in her shoulders, which had been there since she arrived at the gardener's cottage, was sliding away. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the envelope, placed it in her lap. What's that? Will whispered. Clara sucked in a lungful of warm air. A letter, she said. One that doesn't belong to me. So I'm going to leave it there, but I reckon in the next chapter we might find out what that letter says, or a bit more about it at least. Okay, but we can leave it there. I'll see you tomorrow.